Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of PRI in person. My name is Tim Steinweg. I am the head of Stewardship for Nature at PRI. And I would like to welcome you not only to day 3 of PRI in person, but also to this breakout session, Nature Stewardship, Spring and Responsible Political Engagement. Now, I'd like to kick us off by pointing out that despite what you may gather from the title, PRI in no way is suggesting that either nature stewardship or responsible political engagement are seasonal activities. As you will hear from a great panel of speakers today, these are issues that remain relevant all year throughout. Because during today's session, we will discuss the latest in investor stewardship on the topic of nature. In particular, we'll discuss the role of public policies to tackle forest loss and land degradation, one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, and the need for responsible political engagement by corporates in order to provide the opportunities for the development and implementation of exactly such policies. We've been talking about these topics throughout the conference. Really, we'll be focusing in on the topic of nature today. We'll explore what is seen as responsible practice if and when companies engage with policymakers on this topic. We'll gain insights into why it can be problematic when companies act in less responsible or less transparent ways, or have their engagements be informed by more short-term interest. We'll delve into how investor action over the last decade and a half has evolved to look beyond voluntary action by companies, and has incorporated the regulatory context in its stewardship and engagement activities. So we have a fantastic and very wide range of speakers for you today, coming from the investment community and civil society, with expertise on political engagement and deforestation, coming from the global north and the global south. So we're really excited to hear this diverse range of views to really delve into the topics of the details of this important topic. So at PRI, we coordinate a range of different stewardship initiatives. All of them ultimately have a theory of change to seek to drive progress on the drivers of system-level sustainability issues that ultimately threaten the investment returns of diversified investors. One overarching theme in all of these coordinated initiatives is this focus on responsible political engagement, whereby PRI supports engagement with companies to ensure that their political activities are both well-governed and not undermining the interest of investors. Spring also has this focus. So its emphasis on responsible political engagement is a logical outcome of Spring's theory of change. And that theory of change can be summarized as follows. First of all, it focuses on global biodiversity loss as a source of risk for the global economy, for the long-term portfolio returns, and for corporate bottom lines. And as WWF concluded in a report that I believe was released yesterday, more than 70% of wildlife populations have been declined by more than 70% since 1970. And we all know this everlasting repeated figure of half of the world's GDP being moderately or highly dependent on nature. So through Spring, we hope to provide an opportunity to PRI signatories to take effective and efficient action to address these risks. Secondly, it has a specific focus on land use change, one of the 5 key drivers of biodiversity loss, in particular forest loss and land degradation. That is also an issue that remains pressing. The Forest Declaration Assessment released earlier this week concluded that over 6 million hectares of forest was lost in 2023 alone, and that we are really far off the trajectory towards this goal of halting global deforestation by 2030. Spring aims to contribute its real-world outcomes towards this ultimate goal. Thirdly, it's a recognition that the dynamics of forest loss are location-specific. Annual deforestation trends, economic drivers, political context, they differ per country and they evolve over time. So Spring has adopted a sector-agnostic approach, targeting its contributions to those key geographies that face high and imminent risk of future forest loss. It also allows to build in the flexibility for investors to tailor its strategies to the local realities in which their investee companies operate. Fourthly, land use dynamics in these key geographies are often determined by public policies and regulations. Forest moratoria, environmental licensing, demand-side due diligence, and other policy mixes of incentives and regulations have historically shown to be able to swiftly and effectively reduce regional deforestation rates. On the flip side, we've also seen economic incentive mechanisms that inadvertently increase the pressure on forested landscapes. So from that starting point, it makes sense to look at corporate political engagement, because when it is constructive, when it's transparent, when it's consistent across geographies, it can enhance the likelihood of the development and implementation of exactly those sound and supportive public policies that we need, both within countries that hold these tropical forests, but importantly also within those regions that trade and consume commodities originating from these landscapes. So before we delve into this topic further with our excellent set of panelists, just want to really quickly use this opportunity to give you some updates on SPRING. First of all, SPRING is now endorsed by 220 PRI signatories with a combined estimated assets under management of $16 trillion. It officially launched in June of this year, and that launch marked the beginning of the engagement process with a first batch of 40 focus companies that has since been expanded to 60. We now have almost 80 signatories actively participating in these company engagements. These additional 20 company engagement groups are currently being formed. Opportunities to join these as participants remain available. And finally, just to note that we continue to constructively engage with the secretariats of other nature-related investor initiatives and are keen to ensure optimal complementarity and additionality to the work of others. Final note is that we are working on a company assessment framework. This is work in progress. We're hoping to release a final version of this document within the coming months, but just wanted to leave you with a bit of a teaser on the design principles that we're implementing in this work to give you a bit of a sense of what to expect. First of all, this is a framework that's meant to help track progress of SPRING towards its stated objectives. As such, the framework aims to assess corporate performance in line with the company expectations that were outlined in SPRING's investor statement that was released at PRI in person in Tokyo last year. We grouped these expectations into 3 categories: a set of expectations on business operations, risk management, and strategy, on supply chain, secondly, and then thirdly, on political engagement. Excuse me. So secondly, because of the sector-agnostic approach, we have selected a wide range of companies in scope from an array of sectors and headquarter geographies. And therefore, the starting point for this framework has been to include a set of standardized indicators and KPIs that is applicable across companies from various sectors and geographies. We furthermore, and that's, I think, an important element, is that we recognize that there already exists a wide array of nature-related benchmarks and frameworks out there already. As PRI opts not to add to this crowded space and not develop its own set of company scores, but rather leverage the great work of others, including the World Benchmarking Alliance and Influence Map. Fourthly, because of the emphasis on responsible political engagement, we are aiming to include a set of detailed indicators on this element in particular, to really allow the SPRING participants to capture the nuances of what it means to act responsibly in this space. And then finally, we also, I'm sorry, my phone is acting up a little. So finally, we also recognize that there's additional frameworks that are designed to assess company performance, either for some of SPRING's focus companies or for some of the elements of its expectations. We recognize the value of these frameworks. We therefore, in addition to the overarching assessment framework, will also provide SPRING participants with guidance on a selection of high-quality external resources to allow for in-depth company engagement and not inadvertently keep it too high level and superficial. So that's it. Before we move into the panel discussion, just want to remind you to please submit all the questions that you have to the panel via Slido in the PRI in-person app. We will have plenty of time to delve into those, so I greatly encourage you to submit all the questions that you have. And to please help me welcome on the stage now today's moderator, Leslie Samuel Rich, President of Green Century Capital Management. And she will introduce the other panelists. Thank you.
Right? Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the panel. Am I too loud or is this okay? Good? Okay, great. Well, I will love to introduce our panelists. We have one person joining on video because she was unable to make it here today. And that's Charlotta from AP7, based in Sweden. But let me first welcome up Jose Pugas from JGP. I've been practicing, but I messed it up anyway, from Brazil. Next, let me welcome, yes, right there, thank you very much. Greta Fearman from Canada. I'm sorry, I had the order wrong. Glenn Hurowitz from Mighty Earth from Washington, D.C. And lastly, can we have the screen up for Rebecca Farr from Influence Map in London? And there you are. Hello, Rebecca. Can you hear us?
I can. Hope you can hear me.
Okay, great. So as Tim mentioned, I'm Leslie Samuel Rich. I'm the president of the Green Century Funds. I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel. Green Century is a fossil fuel-free, environmentally responsible mutual fund company based in the United States. We have been working on what now is called biodiversity and nature-related risks for about a decade, engaging companies across the supply chain of palm, soy, and more recently, timber and beef. And it's very exciting that this issue now has risen to the level where not only people are talking about it at this global conference, but there are new initiatives like Spring that enable us to go beyond the company-by-company engagements around specific policies like zero deforestation, or people are familiar with NDPE, no deforestation, peat, or exploitation. The goal of this panel, as Tim alluded to, was to share some different perspectives, explain the theory of change behind it, and then illustrate the evolution of work that's happened on these issues over time, and what brings us to today, why we're focusing on political engagement. Maybe not everyone in the room is at that stage yet, but many are, and even if you haven't done engagement on this issue directly with companies yet, you can still participate at this level, which I'm sure Tim will tell you more about as we close the panel. So first, I'm going to lay the context that Charlotta was going to give us. Again, Charlotta was from AP7. It's a Swedish pension fund that manages $900 billion for 5 million Swedish savers. They noticed that prior to 2015, investors' climate engagement with companies focused mainly on the company's direct emissions. I think we're all familiar with that. But they believe there was a blind spot around focusing on policy engagements. And so leading up to the Paris Agreement on Climate, AP7 identified several corporate policy engagements, for good and bad, as an important factor that influenced the Paris Agreement. And then afterwards, it became even more apparent that after the Paris Agreement was ratified, that corporate influence was playing a very significant role in what companies were then doing. Many companies curbed their enthusiasm for many of the policy measures, and consequently, they either watered down or completely withdrawn, which is not the direction, obviously, we wanted to go in. But I did ask her, have there been any success on this? And she pointed to one example I want to share, which is AP7 launched a joint project. It came out of a PRI investor statement around corporate influence. And in 2018, the Church of England, Pension Board, BNP Paribas, and AP7, working within the CA100 framework, led dialogues with 40 companies in Europe. And companies did start to disclose their political influence. And now 5 years later, there are 70 companies doing this. So that was some good progress to start us off. And then as a result, more and more companies are reporting, and many of the stakeholders came together to establish protocols on how companies should report their climate engagement, which was the Global Standard on Responsible Climate Lobbying in 2002. And then finally, before we turn to our panelists, some lessons that we can draw from those experiences to bring to our experience and work now is that, first, corporations are not always equipped to have the conversation with investors about political influence because it's not directly related to their operations. As you may know, when you're speaking with companies, you're mostly talking to those kinds of people and those things. So we need to get the environmental staff or sustainability teams and then the public affairs team, which is mostly dealing with corporate influence, to get together and get in sync. Two, it helps to team up with an independent knowledge partner. AP7 worked with Influence Map, as well as drew on research from the academics at the London School of Economics to analyze companies and then help develop these standards. And then third, transparency always is a good step. In this case, it's the first step. But what ultimately we need is stronger policies around corporate influence. And we need to be clear about that and push for more. So I hope that lays the context for our panel today. And let me first ask questions of Rebecca. Rebecca, can you please tell us, there's a lot of talk about what's meant by responsible political engagement.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. It's great to be joining the conversation today. To introduce Influence Map very briefly, we're a non-profit think tank that has tracked corporate engagement on climate policy for nearly 10 years. And in the last couple of years have expanded our focus to track political engagement on nature-related issues. And like our work on climate, our output on nature will consist of publicly available metrics and profiles that demonstrate whether companies are supportive of nature-related policy and how engaged they are. Now, our assessments don't require the cooperation of the companies that we assess, but we do have hundreds of engagements with companies each year, both directly and in conjunction with investors. So essentially, we consider responsible political engagement on nature to be engagements with policymakers that are aligned with the science of nature loss and of the ambitions of governments attempting to implement policies to achieve the goals of the Global Biodiversity Agreement.
Thank you. Can you tell us how Influence Map is reviewing the corporate practices? What indicators you're looking for?
Yeah, of course. So I'd like to go into a bit more detail, firstly, on how we decide whether engagement is relevant to nature, and then secondly, maybe the most important activities to consider under the term political engagement. So when it comes to defining political engagement on nature, we consider policies that aim to address any of the key drivers of biodiversity loss. So this includes issues such as habitat change, overexploitation, invasive species, and pollution. And then for each of these drivers, there are a number of policy areas that come into play. So, for example, habitat change can include policies relating to deforestation, land degradation, biofuels, and marine protected areas. And we're also looking at types of regulation that grant protections to specific species, often from a combination of drivers of biodiversity loss. So examples of this would be the Endangered Species Act in the US and the Birds and Habitats Directive in the EU. So overall, this means there's potentially a huge amount of policy that we could be considering under the umbrella of nature-related policy. But unsurprisingly, we do find that corporates are most engaged on areas most relevant to their own operations and supply chains. And then to turn to what we consider as political engagement, I think this is important too. So we use a very broad definition of political engagement, drawing on guidance from the UN that includes a range of activities that companies might undertake to influence government policy. So this includes direct engagements with governments, regulators, to impact sort of the final policy decisions, and that's kind of what's traditionally seen as lobbying. Policy influencing can also happen further upstream, where companies try to influence what's on or off the policy agenda, and it can also include wider attempts to influence the general public and the narrative around nature or climate, so using things like social media, traditional media, and advertising. So that broad bucket of activities constitutes what we would consider as direct engagement, but it's also really critical to consider how companies are engaging with policy through industry associations. And our research on climate has demonstrated that certain industry associations have been extremely disruptive to climate policy, and we're already seeing similar patterns in our nature work. Now, associations allow companies to pool resources and utilize experienced lobbying operations, but they can also be used to provide public distance between companies and their most negative policy positions. And another concerning dynamic that plays out through industry associations is them taking the lowest common denominator position among their members, whereas if we map out the positions of all the members of an association from the most supportive to the most oppositional, very often we find that the association is taking a position more aligned with their more negative members. And there's a number of governance reasons, and this can be very specific to different associations, but one common theme that comes through is that companies that have the most to lose from a regulation are the most vocal and ensure that the association takes their position. And conversely, companies that are less affected may choose to stay quiet on the basis that they will then be able to shape policy positions more of concern to them. But industry associations taking this lowest common denominator position can be a really big problem, because associations are really influential when they speak to policymakers, claiming to speak on behalf of entire sectors, or in the case of cross-sector groups, the entire economy, even if this position may only reflect a few of their members. So yeah, hopefully that gives you an idea of how we're assessing this. And yeah, I'm glad that you reflected, Leslie, on some of the advancements that have been made in the climate space, and we're looking forward to supporting investors make these same advances in nature.
Thank you very much. That is very helpful information as we look to define collectively what's responsible and what's not irresponsible corporate influence. So we're going to turn to Glenn Hurowitz, the CEO of Mighty Earth and the founder. And Glenn, for 10 or 15 years, investors in NGOs like yourself have been making a lot of progress on commodities in Southeast Asia and Brazil and other areas. So why now are NGOs like Mighty Earth, who's been instrumental in securing a lot of those changes, why are you looking at political influence?
Thank you, Leslie. Well, I think the success has been from the beginning, right alongside you and Green Century, which it's been such heroic and important work. That's a great example for, I think, how investors can successfully engage. I think the private sector has driven enormous positive change. If you look at deforestation, for instance, investors' engagement along with supply chain action has driven a 90% decline in deforestation for palm oil, rubber, and pulp and paper across Southeast Asia and the Congo Basin. That is a gigaton scale climate win. It means that there are thousands and thousands of orangutans and tree kangaroos and Sumatran elephants and others that are alive today that wouldn't be. And I know a lot of forests all over those regions, specific forests that are standing today because of those efforts, because this whole industry adopted stronger policies. So that's where we see the great potential, and there's still an enormous need for that. Across the board, there's increasing pressures. There's state-backed development projects. I think this is ultimately the reason. To a significant extent, the drivers of deforestation are shifting in some regions, and really the drivers of nature destruction more broadly. So in Southeast Asia, where once we saw large international commercial companies that were buying those products driving deforestation, now the drivers have shifted to the state pursuing sort of old school state development projects and using cronies that are associated with those companies to sometimes drive development of agricultural commodities, minerals, coal, etc. I think this is why investors need to speak up on policy, because it is when you have governments taking a more active role, as they've been a broad populist shift, not only in the West, but in many developing countries as well. They need to hear about what the consequences of that are for their broader economy. In Indonesia, for instance, there is an authoritarian-leaning government coming into power. They are really keen to continue growing their access to international markets. And I think at the same time, they're pursuing the world's largest deforestation project in Papua to clear over 2 million hectares of forests for sugarcane, for bioethanol, and other products. They need to hear from investors that kind of activity will make them less likely to invest in a country that's pursuing those sorts of projects. And I think equally importantly, highlight the opportunities to invest in a clean energy economy, invest in nature conservation for all of the benefits that it brings. And that's really important. Second, the progress on deforestation in particular that I mentioned is not complete. It's true that in terms of commitments, together we have made substantial progress on making change in the meat industry. The meat industry is the largest driver of deforestation. It causes more climate pollution than the entire transportation sector, and it's the leading driver of land grabbing in agriculture. We have seen some of the big animal feed companies and even cattle companies make improved commitments. They still have a lot to do on implementation. And right now, we are seeing some of the biggest fires on record across Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and elsewhere. This is a huge environmental crisis. It is why this kind of thing and the decisions that some of those companies are making is why you have what WWF and ZSL came out with this morning, which was a 70% decline in wildlife population since 1970, which is a really sort of shocking number. They say it's 95% in Latin America, which is sort of really where the frontier for the meat industry is. And we need to keep up the private sector action on that, but also policy can be really powerful. So the European Union passed the EU deforestation regulation, which bans the import of products that are linked to deforestation. They have just delayed that for a year. And I think as you have these fires burning all over the world, it is paradoxical that they're, for now, retreating from one of the policy measures that can make a difference. There's a lot of other policy measures like that. I would say in addition, we need more advocacy for both government funding and to make trees and nature and wildlife worth more alive than dead, because nature is valued in most places at almost zero, despite the trillions of dollars of economic opportunity it creates. And that requires investors to weigh in. We've seen through the successes that we've had how much they're listened to. And I think that voice is as important, more important today than ever.
Glenn, in another panel earlier in the conference, the delay in the EU deforestation regulation was attributed to opposition from smallholders. But I think you've had a different take on it. Yeah. Can you just quickly...
Yeah, I think the people saying that it's smallholders opposing it are, generally speaking, the companies that oppose it. And in fact, smallholders are, we work with smallholder cocoa farmers and associations and rubber farmers and associations all over the world. We had a webinar recently with representatives of the Indonesian Palm Oil Growers Association, COCOBOD, the Ghanaian cocoa growers, and a Brazilian government representative. And they talked about all the preparation they've been doing, how they're ready for it, how they do want technical assistance and support from the EU to comply, but we know that they've been doing a lot of compliance. We've also seen, frankly, a lot of companies that are leaders in these sectors getting ready, improving their understanding of their supply chain, getting ready for compliance, making sure they have nothing connected to deforestation in general, and especially being exported to Europe. I've said for a long time that making reference to smallholders is the last refuge of scoundrels. It is what companies that want to keep buying from or have the option to buy from bad actors engaged in deforestation say. They blame small farmers and attribute the advocacy to them when it's coming from them. But what we have seen is, we're here in Canada, we've seen Canadian forest products companies say that even as cocoa farmers making less than $1,000 a year are able to figure out how to comply with the UDR, they somehow can't figure out where the timber that they are logging comes from. We've seen large companies like Bunge, Cargill, ADM engage in similar lobbying. And when you look at their reports that they provide to investors, they say they have 97, 98, 99, 100% traceability for soy animal feed, which is the leading driver of deforestation connected to imports to Europe. And yet they are somehow claiming to the EU that it's impossible to comply with the things that they are already aware of. They know, these big companies are very aware of where their products are coming from. They've made progress on that, actually. And it's unfortunate. I think it's important as investors to scrutinize some of the propaganda that some of the companies often persuasively will say behind the scenes or even publicly. I think Mighty Earth, PRI, many other organizations are resources to like fact check, and I really would I think where we have seen the best progress is where investors and experts in civil society, academia, government are actually working very closely together and coordinating to drive action on companies. And we can provide the information to say like, no, look, and here's, I'll set up conversations with the associations in affected countries.
Thank you. Greta, thank you for being here today. And we'd love to hear your perspective from a developed market space. How does working on responsible political engagement complement the other investor action, including the use of satellite monitoring and the push for more supply chain disclosures?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I lead a stewardship team at Cardano Asset Management, and we've been engaging on deforestation and nature for a few years now, and using some of these tools. So yeah, I can get into how I think the responsible political engagement is complementary. But thinking back to where we started, and still are using, tools like geodata and satellite monitoring has been useful to exactly your point, Glenn, to help us with the traceability. I think 5-6 years ago, companies still didn't understand their supply chains very well, especially in places like Brazil. So having the geodata and satellite monitoring to connect on the ground deforestation to suppliers and then all the way up the chain to the producers and to the consumer brand companies, to the retailers, I think that helped establish that visibility on the issue and to connect, again, companies all the way through to deforestation. It's also really useful now as it's evolving to add layers of biodiversity over that satellite monitoring. So you can look for the incidents that are in the most biodiverse regions. But still, again, the limitations are that it's really about visibility and monitoring and often about compliance. And I think where responsible political engagement really complements is that it's really about the rules of the game. I think I've seen through doing these engagements for a few years that kind of compliance and voluntary efforts like companies telling their suppliers, don't do this or do that. I mean, it has had an effect. There has been improvements, but I think we've reached a point where the rest needs to happen through policy, especially in areas like Brazil and others where smallholders are cropping up and really being the leading cause of deforestation because it's, moving to the smallholders. And if they're not incentivized to change, if they're just told by their companies, check my supplier code of conduct, you need to stop deforesting, well, they're impoverished. There's huge economic pressures on them to provide the supply. They're not financially incentivized. They're being paid the same wage. Why would they change? So we need for the companies to involve themselves in political engagement so that we can come up with on the ground enforcement of regulations or implementing of incentives that actually will, pay these farmers to want to change. I think that's really the only way that will make it, the structural change we need to see. Maybe one example in the Cerrado where it's actually legal to deforest right now to a certain extent or to convert land. I think that's a good example where companies can really look at their trade association memberships and work within them and understand their leverage, which I think they really don't use their leverage at this point properly, we're seeing, to really push for policies in the Cerrado and other regions that will, again, get the incentives to the right places to create those those market conditions. And this is part of the reason we joined the Spring Initiative, because I think it's been missing from a lot of engagements, is really looking at the root causes of these issues. A lot of times we talk about setting goals and setting targets, and that does help, but we need to really start engaging on the rules that set the conditions.
Great, thank you. Hello, Pugas. So thanks for coming from Brazil. And want to turn to you to get a perspective from an emerging market. And so how does the Brazilian financial community think about these developments?
Well, first of all, nice to meet you all. Good to see some familiar faces. Well, I think that the financial sector can't be understood as a single organism. So have plenty different mandates. Banks are different from asset managers. They are different from asset owners, different from cooperatives. So it's a mega diverse ecosystem, even more in countries like Brazil, in which we have a highly sophisticated financial sector and a very extremely national financial sector, because during most of the time we are very far from international capital. And when we look at Brazil, we are fairly peculiar in many different stuffs. We are among the 10 richest countries, but at the same time, we are an emerging economy. So at the same time that we have the largest biodiversity in the world, we lead the deforestation indicator. So it's complicated. So it's not easy to understand Brazil, but put faith on us. We can make the things done. And one of these optimistic arguments that I can use is that the Brazilian financial sector understood that deforestation is bad for business. It's not good for anyone. So we can look through the altruistic perspective. I try to look on a very selfish perspective here. Deforestation makes us a pariah for too long. We spent many years, terrible years, as a matter of fact, out of the international community because of the deforestation, because of biodiversity laws, because we were not enforcing one of the most robust environmental legal systems in the world, like Brazil has. And this is something that we don't want to repeat. When we look at the worst years of the deforestation, the financial sector started moving to make a common approach on deforestation. You saw much more initiatives coming from the financial sector than from the public sector on how to tackle properly deforestation, but on a very hushing approach because of the political polarization that we had in Brazil during those years. So, but for example, the banks were the first to say, okay, we're not going to finance any kind of deforestation in Amazon, legal or illegal. At the same time that we started pushing for more traceability to have better indicators. But what I consider that is the two major difference between Brazilian financial sector, international financial sector, and this approach is the first one, that we understand there is a transition. For a long, long time, we were pushed, not just internally, but by international community, to produce more food. And I don't want to be anachronic here saying that we were wrong. We were completely wrong, but I didn't know that we were wrong back then. But now we know that we are. So how we can transition to zero deforestation, to nature positive approach on agriculture. When we look at Brazil, crop rotation, regenerative agriculture, dark planting, no tillage, are those practices extremely common. 80% of our farmers apply those techniques. It's not something that is on niche. But it was something that we consider so obvious that we never put that in highlight. We are starting to make that happen, put in highlights. But we need to finance this transition. So I think there's the first peculiarity in Brazil. We understand there is a transition process. And the second peculiarity, more than just to ban, we prefer to include. We prefer to have a constructive collaboration with the real economy, creating positive incentive mechanisms for those who are out of our compliance framework to be back in our compliance mode. Because most of them, they are 3-4 generations doing the same thing, and they were applauded for 4 generations. Now they understand that they're not in a good way. So how can we make them be better? And politically speaking, it's impossible in a democracy not to talk politics. In a democracy, who defines the national development program is the government that is elected by the people. It's not the financial sector. Our role as financial sector is to support those policies, to make it work. And as citizens, if the policy is wrong, to resist and to change it democratically. So the financial sector in Brazil is close to the government, but always trying to keep full transparency for sure, but go collectively. We don't do individual engagements with the governments. We do collective engagements. That's why we have such strong sector representations like FEBRABAN, is the Federation of Banks, or ANBIMA, the Capital Markets Association. So when we talk collectively. It's not a question of bank A, of asset manager B, talking to the government. It's a collective approach saying, look, those are our standards. And we are here because we have skin in the game. We are not just pushing the government. We are building with the government. Not because we are the powerful financial sector, but because we are concerned citizens. And we want to make this economy work. And finally, I think that two large events happened on the last month. The first one was the ecological pact that was signed by the three branches of the government, by the judiciary, the legislative and executive branch, saying that, okay, we agree that the ecological transition and the green economy is the future of Brazil. So let's work together. No more fallacies, no more procrastination. We are going to work together because it's good for the economy, it's good for society. And the week after that was the time for the economy to join efforts mostly led by financial sector. Over 50% of GDP signed a letter saying, we are together saying that the economy depends on nature. So we need to protect nature if we want to improve the economy. Without any kind of pressure, only with backstage conversations, Brazil is relationship-driven economy, relationship-driven society. Letters do not work with us. So it's much more to be talking, to make it happen. Very silently, we make a lot of noise, signing those letters and saying, okay, we understand that is the future. Now it's a common sense for Brazilian financial sector and Brazilian real economy, and I think even more than in some governments, that the only future possible for us is on the green economy. There's a generation opportunity for us. We can lead that, but we have to lead by example, not because we have the largest biodiversity or because we produce more food than anyone else. It's because the right thing to do, and we are going to be the best doing that. So there's a common sense already. And at the financial sector level, we understand that we can start creating some global excellence financial products to the rest of the world. But I will not fool you. If we don't have the proper response for international community, we will keep ourselves isolated. Most of the Brazilian beef production is for domestic consumers, and not for exporting, and definitely not for Europe. So when some of the policies that are pushed very negatively, banning our economy, it backlashes because we stop talking. We take it very personal. We are a very Catholic culture. We take it personal a lot. So the best way for us to keep connected, keep the conversation flowing, is to drive positive arguments, to include us. If you think that we are relevant, and we are, if you think that we are important, and we are, and we know that, not so well as you do. I think that the world recognizes more the size of Brazil than Brazil itself. Catholic heritage. And so it's something that you should keep it positive, showing us the way and showing us that we are going on the good way. If the engagements keep being going only through letters, through slaps in the hand, through public denunciations, and commercial protectionism disguised as environmental policy, it is not productive conversation. So it's, and unfortunately there will be others less concerned about the environment that will like to have productive conversation with ours. So it's not ideal for the Brazilian financial sector. It's not the way that we want to do. It's not the way that we want to make. But there's something that is a good alert for everyone. We'll talk with the national politics. We are talking with national politicians to make it work. But we need a response from the international community. And the best response is engaging positively and investing. So Brazil, when you look at the debt industry, it's 10 times the size of the equity industry. So our stock exchange compared to our debt industry is very tiny. The debt industry is extremely high.
Right.
So we can make much more pressure through bonds than through equity. That's the reality.
Right.
And when you do that, when you create this pressure through bonds, the international community, the international capital responds for less than 2% of the total Brazilian bonds. 98% is Brazilian capital. As we said, we have a very strong financial sector, but it's very isolated from international community. So not just consider to engage with Brazilian economy, but also to engage with Brazilian financial sector, because we are pushing very hard there.
Right.
Don't try to crowd us out of the discussion.
Right? Yeah, a real call to action. I want to go back through the panelists before we open up for questions. So again, you can write your questions in through the app, Slido, I think it's called. What changes, and Rebecca, we'll start with you. What changes, given the landscape that we're operating in now, would you like to see? We'll just do a quicker round on this. So get us started, please. I think she can't hear us or can't hear us. So we'll give her a moment, and then we're going to go to you.
Sorry, is that okay?
Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
You're back. Excellent. Just to repeat the question is, what change are you hoping to see, given where we are now in addressing nature risks and biodiversity loss?
Yeah, so I think we're hopeful that there's the possibility to really rapidly mainstream responsible political engagement into biodiversity plans and disclosures from companies. And there are a couple of reasons why I think this can happen really quickly. So firstly, because this is something that companies can choose to act on immediately. It just takes will. It's not hugely complex. It's not, you don't have to map out an entire supply chain to understand exactly what's going on here. It's something that companies can do tomorrow, and it can have a big impact. And secondly, because a lot of the hard work has already been done here on climate. So there's already a lot of consensus that's been built around the responsible, the global standard and responsible climate lobbying. And we think, this is easily transposed into the nature space. So hoping that can happen quickly as well.
Glenn?
So I think that, number one, we need investors to be as, if not even more, engaged on nature as they are on energy.
Okay.
Nature represents 37% of the solution to the climate crisis and gets less than 3% of the funding. And I think I see that reflected, mirrored in the investor community. And it's absolutely right. We need investors to go beyond writing letters to show up with companies and in countries. That is vital. I think it is at a human level, it is a very valuable experience to go to the places that your investments affect. I know that the investors who've done that come home with a lifetime of passion and a much deeper understanding and an ability to engage, and also to engage with more credibility when you've actually been there and talked to people. And I think it's not just true in Brazil, it's also frankly true in the United States a lot of the time, or Canada, that showing up makes a real difference in terms of your ability to drive action. So I would strongly encourage getting on the plane. And I will say, one of the foremost experts on transportation told me that if you save 1 hectare of peatland rainforest on a trip, you can fly thousands of your friends around the world first class and still not have the same carbon impact as that 1 hectare of peatland rainforest. So the consequences of the nature work are much greater than understood. And then secondly, I just want to reinforce, where we see success from investor engagement is when there is that close collaboration with civil society. And I think that's beneficial to us too, to understand what your needs are, what you are hearing directly from companies, because they sometimes are more direct, candid with investors necessarily than they are with civil society. Where we don't see as much progress is when the two sectors go it alone. And so I think sometimes investors if they don't have the backing and the grounding, it's easier to be hoodwinked and just not get concrete results and be pawned off with nice phrases about their love of Mother Nature instead of real action.
Right. It's right. I think I know that in the U.S., some investors like Green Century do work with NGOs, but there is a little bit of a reluctance to do that. So I would encourage people to get over that in a way that you can still use them as a resource. And so when you're in an engagement, if you don't have someone who is a deep forest expert, you will know whether what the company is telling you is legitimate or, kind of more the PR people are in there doing it.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe to extend your advice and action call, I think, yes, we need to engage more on nature, but I also think investors and active ownership and stewardship teams really need to start engaging on the topics that relate to the root causes of nature issues and really understanding those. And really that has a lot to do with public policy, since that really sets the scene. And I think that will really help accelerate the action on nature. And I think, it is a big learning curve, really understanding the public policy environment and also in different regions. That's why I'm thankful for initiatives like Spring, who are hooking us up with different market players. And what we've also done in the past, engaging with NGOs before talking to the companies has really been helpful. We've talked to, Tim, before when you were at Rainforest Norway, for example, but Aid Environment, WWF in Brazil, find your connections and use them to start really digging in and focus on doing higher quality engagements where you really understand the market place of the companies where they're located to strengthen the engagements.
Thanks. Pujas?
I think that, final disclaimer, don't move based on misconceptions. Most of the times when I look engagements, public or private engagements, with the Global South, it's based on a lot of misconceptions. Is based on, okay, there's a lot of corruption and the governance is very soft. No, it's not like that. It may be different, doesn't mean that it's worst. And the best way of avoid those misconceptions, as you said quite well, 86% of our grid is already renewable. We don't need to worry about energy, we need to worry about nature. That's why nature-based climate solutions is the best cost benefit in Brazil. How many international investors engage on nature in Brazil, despite deforestation? I've never seen any. Mm-hmm. And we are leading most of the coalitions in Brazil. So the best way of avoid that is that if the global capital acts through a local perspective. So make partnership with local players. Understand before debating. Understand before engaging. That's important, and there will be a major, the learning curve you said will be much better, will be much faster if you are able to exchange informations before we create our own impressions on the places that we are trying to engage.
Right. Thank you. And before I turn to questions, which feel free to write some more in, we've got a couple coming in, which is great. For Green Century, after engaging with company by company and across the supply chain, it is very frustrating to see those policies not enacted sometimes or on a much longer timeline. And then the other biggest thing, though, going back to really what Spring is about, is when there are policies at the level, which we've talked a lot about at this conference, not just engaging with companies, but at the public policy level, if those firms or companies rather are involved directly or indirectly through those trade associations and essentially are lobbying for policies that would undermine the agreements that we all have worked so hard to get, then it feels like we have to go to this place where we're asking them to have the left hand and the right hand of the company work together, or maybe that is their strategy in a kind of worst case scenario, that they're saying something to us and setting a policy agreement, but then they know full well that their lobbying arm and trade association is going to try to undermine it. And so then all our work kind of goes out the window. Excellent. So I'm going to take the question from Joe first. So what sectors, companies, or industry associations are most actively engaged with policymakers? And are there any potential leaders, good guys, good women out there emerging that are taking, positive steps on the proactive? It's not directed to anyone in particular.
Well, I would say which ones are engaged. There's a lot of companies that are engaged in a negative direction, unfortunately, I think, but it's not all of them. So, we unfortunately have continued to see in the meat industry in particular, I think, broad negative engagement with policymakers to weaken environmental protection, to not, I'll choose one specific issue in Brazil. The Brazilian government formerly made transparent some traceability information about the origins of cattle so that you could, it was easier to, not perfect, but it was easier to track where cattle went. The number one way right now that irresponsible cattle ranchers avoid scrutiny is they take a cow that's born on a recently deforested ranch, and then maybe a few days before slaughter send it to a ranch that was deforested 50 years ago, and then sell it to JBS or Minerva or Marfrig, and then JBS can say, oh, it's totally clean, we bought it from a ranch that was cleared a long time ago. And this can be a big business for the middlemen. And so, I think that's, they have, as far as we can tell, the meat industry has not been as proactive as possible in asking the government to allow them to share that data more broadly so that they can police it. Second, they actually, I just want to say, they also could require that traceability information themselves. They don't actually need the government to require it. So that is it's sometimes private sector, it's sometimes government. On the other hand, there are usual, where companies have actually taken responsible action voluntarily, they are much more likely to support or at least not oppose positive action. So on the EU deforestation regulation, which I think is worthy of discussion because it is probably the most international forest policy of the last decade, we have seen companies like Michelin and Goodyear be willing to support it in the rubber industry. We've seen Barry Callebaut in the cocoa industry talk about that they think these things are helpful. We've seen a lot of the companies that are actually preparing for compliance be willing to support it, and that's been really helpful counterweight to some of the, I think, reckless lobbying that we've seen from irresponsible companies. So, and I think looking across issues, it could be methane pollution in agriculture, which is a huge issue. It mostly is coming from the meat industry also. There are companies that, like Danone, that have said, we're going to reduce our methane emissions 30% by 2030. And they are, as a result, more willing to be vocal in encouraging policymakers to finally tackle agricultural methane pollution as well.
Right, okay.
I think there's one important consideration is that it's never only one trader association for a sector. Most of the time there are many. Mm-hmm. And some are guided by good principles, others guided by protectionism or keeping back practices. So when you decide as an investor to engage on a specific trader association, you are enforcing the guidelines of this association. So for example, when you talk about meat, beef industry in Brazil, there are some I will not name. I don't think there will be polite from me, Brazilian way of doing things. But there are some associations that are fully pro traceability. They see there is a problem to achieve better markets when you don't have full transparency. And others who operate on the other way say, okay, if you provide full traceability, the smallholder, poor guy will be threatened by that. You need to choose who are you going to support. It's not just take one trade association as the example of everything. And so to create on your engagement plans, which are the ones that you must support and which are the ones you should avoid, and how to enforce the ones that are more aligned to your principles. it's essential. In Brazil, for example, subnational governments act quite differently from each other. We have states like Pará, who always led the deforestation indicators. Currently, it's the only state where I can have food traceability sponsored by the government, by the state government. I can have both direct and indirect. Until 3 years ago, they were not releasing even the direct information. It was thanks to very good action from the financial sector and from media association that says, no, please make it transparent, because with that we can level the competition. Otherwise, we can be the bolder, but there will always be small slaughterhouses that do not care about that, and they will buy the cattle, and we will lose our product and our engagement with the farmer. So to sponsor those trade associations and understand that supranational government has the role, it's something smart to do in countries like Brazil.
And then the other thing about the trade associations we've heard from companies engaging with on this topic is that there are members of trade associations that actually conflict within the association itself. So oftentimes they'll be really supportive of a policy to improve traceability, but then on the other hand, lobby to weaken a policy on deforestation, so they can really represent both sides. So it's then therefore important for the companies to be very active in the trade associations that they do choose to be members of, and use their leverage to ensure the consistency of the stances of the trade associations. I think that's where they really do have a lot of leverage, so we can stop having that conflicting messages coming from within one single industry association.
Can I make a just quick
If it's
comment
quick.
on very quick? That's 100% agree on that, and I think it's very powerful, and we need more of engagement within the trade associations. Sometimes it's not possible because they do have lowest common denominator dynamics, and it is okay to work with a coalition of the willing of companies, and that is more often where we see positive, responsible engagement coming from the private sector.
Right. And then, Rebecca, could we use resources at Influence Map to find out which companies are in which trade associations, or is that something still in development?
It is still in development, but that's something that we're working on at the moment, and we have a good database for this on the climate side, so we're already happy to help with any requests that come in. I was maybe going to comment on the sectors question as well, and we're seeing things very, very similar to what Glenn said. Meat, dairy, agrochemicals industries seem to be a big problem and very oppositional to most policies that we're tracking. And conversely, the sectors that seem potentially more positive, and caveat this by saying we are still quite nascent in our analysis, are sectors like consumer staples and retailers. So we're also interested in exploring whether there's the opportunity for these more positive companies to influence policy engagement further up their supply chains as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we need to, Tim, is it correct? Yeah, one more question? Okay, good. We have time for one more question. I don't think we know this, but are there any examples of successful engagements around political influence? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Yes, can you give us a quick one?
Sure. I think that Brazil have two large examples. The methane law, in which we established limits for methane emissions. It was a success during the COP26 Glasgow. Eduardo Paz here, who led this approach to make it enforcement of the methane in Brazil. And the second one was the restoration of the legal enforcement of the deforestation regulations in Brazil. So once we had this shift in the government, most of the structures from the law enforcement, they were totally destroyed by the last government, and we were able to fundraise, we were able to connect, we were able to join the government and make this transition happen very optimistically. And that's, we just see the Amazon deforestation indicators, they totally dropped after we started making this engagement. So
Great, thanks. Glenn, were you saying you had one?
I think there's a lot of them. I actually think the EUDR is an example of success, because one of the ways that we were able to help pass it was by getting many of the companies I mentioned earlier to say that even though they were regulated by it, they supported it because it was vital to reduce deforestation. And I think from a self-interested perspective, they saw reducing the risk of deforestation as something positive for them, because even if it came with potential sanction, if they weren't acting responsibly, they could say, if you bring down deforestation, they're able to say that their products that they're selling are more responsible, and that's also more appealing to investors.
Right, and reducing their risk. Okay, great. We're going to welcome Tim back on the stage to wrap us up. But let me afterward, we'll give a hand to all the panelists for all their excellent things that they have said and shared with us.
No, I think maybe we should do that now, no? Can you please help us?
Okay,
thank,
all right.
So thanks so much. I think we've come near the end of today's session. I hope you found it useful. I hope you had gained a lot of new insights. I know I did. One of the ones that I hope is a takeaway for all of you is sort of this idea of the evolution of approaches, right? As the world around us changes, so do stewardship approaches. And I think what this panel has illustrated is that one of the evolutions is that it does bring together an array of people and organizations with decades-long experience on their fields that are coming together into a really exciting and relevant and important, urgent topic. And it's both exciting and it's energizing and it's needed and it's important. And I think the other takeaway is really this, throughout the conference, I think this week we've seen this realization of recognizing that investors and companies don't only are exposed to risk or have impacts on the natural world through their direct investments, their direct operations, or even purely through their individual supply chains, but also through the fact that they are a conversation partner with policymakers. They have an influence in this type of policy, public policy development, for better and for worse. And it's that's starting to bring together. We've hoped to capture some of those evolutions, some of that zeitgeist in spring as well, and we'd be keen to continue to talk to you about that. Leave you with a final simple call to action is essentially to have a look at the Spring website. Consider joining if you're a PRI signatory with a mandate to engage. There's a range of opportunities still available to get involved in the engagements with companies of particular relevance to you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to ask questions, to discuss. We'd be keen to hear from you. So thank you very much.